G'day and welcome to Does It Matter? I've had some interesting conversations with a lot of people about their ethnic heritages and their histories and the way they view the world now, based upon all manner of anecdotal and collected evidence. One of the things I notice is that lots and lots of us, perhaps most of us, which is a little depressing, but hopefully we can clear that up in coming decades, believe stories that suit our particular ethnic or cultural heritage. And I think that that's very risky because we all come from cultural heritages that have a vested interest in seeing history in a particular way. And so everyone, the victim narrative trope is so dominant today that, we can all at some point jump on the bandwagon about, our particular ethnic group's suffering. I want to create a small, short narrative of history as I see it in this one area. It doesn't describe all of history at all right? It's not all grim dark, it's not Warhammer 40k, but this is a piece of real history that has been dominant for probably 2,500 years. Okay, prior to that, it was less efficient. Systems were less efficient. The classical systems were less, particularly pre-Roman and pre-Phoenician and Carthaginian, were less efficient in their ability to exploit people. But that didn't mean it didn't happen. It just happened less. Slavery's probably been around for several thousand years. There's evidence of it going back many, many thousands of years, right back to Jericho and beyond. So up to 10,000 years. Its heyday probably peaked in the mid-classical period, sort of 1000 to 500 BC. Those cultures preyed upon each other. In the East, the Chinese, the Indian cultures, North and South in particular, preyed upon each other. Slavery was rife in all those cultures. Warfare and slavery were rife. If you've ever looked at Chinese history, that's 600 years of warfare, which also involved some of the most horrendous genocides inflicted by multiple combatants in it, as well as incredible amounts of slavery. You've got to remember, human labour was the predominant, even more so than animal labour. Human labour, for most of human history, certainly the sort of early to mid-feudal and classical periods, human labour was the predominant thing. So slavery is huge because whole economies ran on it. The Roman Empire ran on it. So did many other comparative empires at the time. They were based to some degree on slavery. The economies would have fallen apart without it. So you had Chinese preying on multiple ethnicities, most of whom are gone now, and it's fairly obvious to see how that happened. In India, there are whole cultures that disappeared as well. The Mughals were responsible for destroying entire cultures in that subcontinent. The Steppes warriors, the Mongols, the Tatars, the Golden Horde, they destroyed entire cultures. The Khwarizm were a huge Middle Eastern culture, the biggest caliphate in Islam, completely destroyed. 10 million people minimum killed, and all their cities razed. So, and the rest thrown into slavery. We've all heard about the transatlantic slave trade, horrendous. Started to really flourish in the 16th century and into the 17th century. But preceding that was a much, much larger slave trade, the Mediterranean slave trade, which also preyed upon both Africans and even more huge numbers of Europeans, as well as their own. So you could be sold as a Muslim into debtorhood if you were seen as a blasphemer, or you were in some way heard reviling the faith, which only required a certain number of people to say so. There's a whole bunch of ways when even a Muslim wasn't safe from slavery, though generally they were. Certainly if you were a European, tens of millions of Europeans were enslaved by their own people and by the predominantly Muslim slave trade. But here's the interesting thing. This is where it gets really interesting. Most of the slave trade wasn't Islamic pirates taking people off ships. A lot of that happened. All right, coming out of Morocco and Tunisia and out of Spain when they'd conquered Spain before the Reconquista. They were preying on people a lot. But guess who sold even more white people, European orientated people, Mediterranean people, to the Muslims to a horrendous fate. Other Europeans. Piracy, the biggest moneymaker in most cases, in most areas, wasn't robbing ships of cargo. Yeah, that was a bonus. That was important. But if they could get slaves, the appetite for slavery was huge. It's been huge forever. And if you could get slaves, healthy young men and women who could be sold to the Turks, sold to many of the Middle Eastern caliphates, sold into Africa as well, sold all over the world. Some of them found their way into China, of all places. All right? So the slave trade, this is tens of millions of people over centuries. From Africa, from Europe, from Asia back into Europe. Like this crisscrossing trade, and it all never could have worked without the assistance of Africans predating upon Africans. That's the main thing. Europeans predating upon Europeans. When they routinely did it anyway. If you got drunk in a pub, you could easily be press ganged. If you fell into debt, you could be forced to do all manner of things. Debt slavery was enormous for a long time. Long after slavery proper was banished by pursued by the British Navy, people were still falling into debt slavery and ending up in penal colonies. It wasn't uncommon at all. So Europeans, Africans and Asians, Middle Easterns, all predated upon themselves. Arguably, I'd say that probably the Muslims were the least internally predacious, but they all did it. They all did it. They all facilitated the exploitation of their own people by other cultures. And what happens today is that the descendants of those victims of those cultures point at the cultures that predated upon them, not realizing that it never could have happened if it wasn't for